Welcome back, YouTube. Today I'm going to walk you through the differences in the basics of fat loss versus building muscle, okay? Because quite often I think a lot of people think there are a lot of big differences in the things they need to be doing when it comes to when they're trying to drop body fat and when it comes to when they're trying to build muscle. Now I'm going to walk you through now what the differences are, because you might be surprised. If you do find this video helpful, if you do like it, please do drop a like and please do subscribe if you haven't already. Let's go. Okay, so in theory, both of these, dropping body fat, building muscle mass, don't need to be complicated. They need to be quite simple. Okay? And when we compare the two and the differences between them, it's exactly the same. It's actually very, very straightforward and very, very simple. And there's actually only a very few differences between the two, whereas a lot of people can believe and think for some reason when they go from fat loss to building muscle mass, a lot and everything needs to change. I'm going to walk you through right now the only few changes that you really need to concern yourself with. Number one, let's start with training. Now, when it comes to training, okay, we know that building muscle mass and retaining muscle mass are both a stimulus determined process, right? So they require a certain level of stimulus to adapt in a certain way to either build muscle mass or retain, okay? That level of stimulus doesn't change when it's building muscle mass, i.e. trying to add muscle mass, or fat loss, i.e. trying to retain muscle mass. The level of stimulus, or what you need to do, doesn't change other than one particular aspect, and that is progressive overload over time. So when you're trying to build muscle mass, you're going to want to make sure that you're progressing things over time, okay? Because to add muscle mass, you do need to be progressing things. You know, that level of stimulus is going to be the same, but the progression of volume over time is going to have to increase, okay? So, you know, you might be shifting more weight over time, you might be shifting more reps over time, more sets. That progressive overload, needs to occur over time. When it comes to fat loss, you're going to struggle to get that level of progressive overload, only because of differences which you're going to come on to in a minute, to other factors within our goal. So you're going to struggle to get the progressive overload. However, what you're doing in terms of level of intensity that you're training, exercise selection, rep ranges, sets to a degree, are all going to be the same, and none of that's really going to change. The only thing that's going to change is your potential lack of ability to progress things over time while trying to drop body fat. And therefore you're not going to build muscle mass, no, but if you're doing the same things that built the muscle, you're going to be doing a good job of retaining the muscle. A lot of people think when they go from building muscle to fat loss, they have to take reps up, or maybe take reps up and reduce weight, you know, or maybe even change the style of their training. Maybe they've gone from weight training and now they think they have to go to cardio or go to circuits or whatever it might be, and you don't. Typically, for the majority of your training, it just simply needs to stay the same, because what built the muscle is going to retain the muscle. So when it comes to training, think of training as a means to retain your muscle during fat loss, and as a means to obviously build muscle during trying to build muscle mass. Don't necessarily think of it in terms of trying to get a fat loss response. Secondly, nutrition. Now this is where the biggest change comes from, okay? Potentially the only real change. Bit of a spoiler for the rest of the video, really. Should maybe have left nutrition till the end. When you're in a fat loss phase, you need to be in a calorie deficit to drop body fat. So you need to be taking in less food than you're burning. Whereas, when you're trying to build muscle mass, you want to be at minimum maintenance. So maintenance will be where your intake matches your expenditure. That's where you want to be at minimum. Okay, now the chances of building muscle mass while you're at maintenance are there, you can do it, but it's not going to be the most ideal situation, okay, because you probably want to be, the situation you want to be in that's going to be most ideal for building muscle mass is a situation that allows you to progress training very well, recover very well, okay, and therefore being in a slight surplus, okay, so taking in more food than you're expending. That's going to be the most ideal energy balance for building muscle mass. So When you're in a fat loss phase, you want to be in a calorie deficit. When you're trying to build muscle mass, you want to be in a slight calorie surplus. They're the two biggest differences when it comes to fat loss versus building muscle mass. Number 3, activity. And what I mean by this is like daily activity, daily expenditure, stuff like steps, okay? Now, when it comes to stuff like steps, and if you want to, we can also try and include here maybe some sort of like conditioning work, so maybe a little bit of cardio and stuff like that, okay? They have two main purposes really that we want to focus on in these two scenarios. One, general calorie expenditure, and 2, conditioning, okay, so health, how well we can recover, stuff like that. First and foremost, expenditure. The main difference between these two things. Obviously, when we're trying to create a calorie deficit for fat loss, expenditure is going to play a big part in that. And therefore, we might want to drive expenditure up, so we're making sure expenditure is higher than intake, right? And therefore, create a calorie deficit. So during general activity, during a fat loss phase, yes, expenditure might be, or activity, sorry, might be higher, might be more. In comparison to building muscle mass, where we might want to reduce that activity a little bit because we want to try and make sure we're in that slight surplus where food is higher than expenditure, right? And if we're just doing more and more activity, we're going to find it harder to eat more and more and more. However, when it comes to conditioning and general health, it's still important during a muscle gain phase to still be well conditioned, okay? So we can again recover well. Training performance isn't going to dip because we're not going to be tired after one set and stuff like that. So in terms of activity in that sense, it's not that we just go completely zero conditioning or expenditure, daily expenditure when it comes to building muscle mass, and we just focus on training and eating more. And in fat loss, we go extremely high on this and focus on doing loads of activity and eating less. During our building muscle mass, we actually might want to keep a little bit of conditioning in there because it might actually help us long term with adding muscle mass. So even though these aren't potentially huge changes, there's something to consider, okay? And it might actually stay relatively more or less the same than you might have first thought. And then lastly, we have sleep. And simply put, sleep doesn't change between the two. Sleep plays a huge role when it comes to dropping body fat and retaining muscle mass, and when it comes to building muscle mass. Sleep needs to be taken seriously just as much during fat loss as it does during building muscle mass. So there you have it. The 4 basics when it comes to fat loss, building muscle mass, and how little they actually change. When it comes to training, type of training is likely going to stay the same, and what you do in sessions is likely going to stay very much the same. The only real difference is we've got to make sure we're applying progressive overload when it comes to adding muscle mass. Nutrition, the only real biggest change within these whole 4 things. With nutrition, fat loss, you need to be in a calorie deficit. Building muscle mass, you want to be in a slight surplus. Activity, might be slight changes here, but relatively pretty much the same, okay? We want to make sure expenditure is high enough during fat loss to help us put us in a deficit, but we want to make sure during building muscle mass that we've still got a decent level for general conditioning, general health. And then sleep, no changes whatsoever. Sleep needs to be taken as a priority for both fat loss and building muscle mass. So there you have it. When you go between one and the other, keep it simple. Not a lot needs to really change. The main thing is just the energy balance in which we're sitting in. I hope you found the video helpful. Please drop a like. If you have any questions, throw them down below and I'll get back to you. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great rest of the week.